when at the very time Raytheon has been supplying bombs to Saudi Arabia to be killing many innocent people in Yemen. He also has his own strategy group, to be killing many innocent. He has his own Austin strategy group, a consulting firm that if you try to get in it right now, you won't be able to, probably because it's swamped by journalists trying to find out more. But other positive thing to say about him is he did push back against the call for deeper US involvement in the conflict in Syria. There is a clip of him being confronted by John McCain in a Senate hearing in which McCain is asking if he would agree to a no-fly zone, and he said no, and McCain was very upset and kept asking him about more that the US should be doing in Syria, and he just held his ground and said he didn't think it was a good idea. So anybody who knows more about General Austin, feel free to say it when you start your presentation. But I think that what we should do is pivot more from talking about Michele Flournoy, who we did a very good job opposing, I must say. We just finished today a letter signed by prominent feminists from around the country, including Gloria and Jane Fonda and V and Eve Ensler and Alice Walker and others, about 80 prominent feminists, about why Michele Flournoy would not be a positive gain for feminists in the US or around the world. And we have been part of a larger group, mostly of progressives, who have been saying that she would be a terrible pick because of several things. Her amazing number of ties with companies that have benefited from Pentagon contracts, to her unending support of US wars, more so even than Biden, and of her her policies that would lead us into a greater conflict with China, which Tabitha was to talk about. Now that we don't need to discuss her, I think we can discuss what we want to see the Pentagon and the Biden administration, if that's okay with you as panelists. And why don't we start with Winslow? And I know you've got a lot to talk about, separate from Michele Flournoy, because you have worked for 4 years on the issue of security defense budgets, military reform. You've worked for the US Senate, for the General Accounting Office, and now you work for the Project on Government Oversight. And you have 2 books. I don't know how you say the name of the first one, Wastrels or Wastrels?
Wastrels.
Wastrels of Defense, How Congress Sabotages National Security, and Military Reform, An Uneven History and an Uncertain Future. So please tell us what you would like to see happening in the Biden administration, Winslow, and thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, and thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it very much. Before I say anything, I should say that I'm retired from the Project on Government Oversight, so don't blame them for anything I say. Quickly about Lloyd Austin, I, like many people, don't know much about him. I've read about him the last couple days when his name started getting seriously floated. There's not much out there about him. His confrontation with Senator McCain speaks highly of him, that he was insufficiently enthusiastic about yet another war with John McCain pounding the table, tells me that There's some hard points in General Austin's character that are admirable. Let me say also, I think we should give him a pass right now. We don't know much about him. We know he has ties to Raytheon and Pine Island and a couple other corporations. We don't know what the nature of that relationship was. That needs to be probed. We don't know what kind of actor he was in CENTCOM about US policy decisions. We need to find out more about him to understand whether he's a step forward or a step backwards or just more of the same. He certainly appears on the surface to be a major improvement over Michele Flournoy. He's not led a post-retirement life dominated by his relationship with corporations. And he's been silent publicly, but we just need to find out more about him. Second point about considering him is I think it's counterproductive to be for or against the nominee because he's male, female, white, black, Asian, military, civilian, whatever. Let's find out whether he would be a good Secretary of Defense and adopt our positions according to what we find out about him. So my view is let's give him a pass right now and find out more about him. About what kind of Pentagon would we like to see? I've written about this for long. I can get you all snoring heavily about it. But I think to make it concise, that there are 4 positions in the Defense Department that people concerned about changing its behavior should be really focused on and should be working hard to try to find the right kind of person for those positions. Those positions are the Inspector General, the Controller, the head of CAPE, Capabilities Assessment and Program Evaluation, and the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. Those are the 4 shops that are the checks, the locus of major checks and balances inside the Pentagon. If you have go-along clowns, as we've had in the past, in those various positions, we're just going to see more business as usual. On occasion in the past, however, for those positions, we've had some really excellent people doing their job properly, challenging ideas, finding out what costs really are, finding out whether weapon X, Y, or Z is a piece of junk like the F-35 or is something that we need more of and serves our forces well. And the controller that is responsible for the auditing of the Pentagon and the catastrophic history we've had for the last 30 years on that problem. So whether General Austin is indeed nominated and does indeed get the job, those 4 positions will be key in making sure that he does do his job and making sure that we in the public get information about how that job is actually going rather than the usual press releases we get from partisans and on Capitol Hill and the spokesman at the Defense Department. I'll stop it there and certainly look forward to hearing what other folks have to say.
Thank you so much, Lo. And I think one of the things that we were excited about this panel is we do have an ideological spectrum here. We don't all agree on the same idea of what we want the Pentagon to look like or probably US foreign policy, which should make a rich discussion. So let's move on to Stephen Semler, who is the co-founder of a group called Security Policy Reform Institute, a think tank to promote meaningful reform U.S. foreign policy, to break the cycle of endless wars and pressing needs of working class Americans. Stephen, you were going to a piece about Michele Flournoy and her position on the surge in Afghanistan. So talk to us about whatever you'd like to talk to us now, and thank you so much for joining us.
I'd be glad to, and I'm appreciative of yours, Medea's, and CodePink's advocacy efforts so far. I think they were a part of the reason why we sort of got a less bad option here. So I applaud you, and I think you did a terrific job, and thanks for having me. I think one of the things to look out for is a sort of US model that is still imperialism, but imperialism light, where it's run through, instead of total war and indefinite occupation, it's run through these train and equip programs. It's a cooperative lens, which is what replaced Michele Flournoy's surge strategy in Afghanistan. It was the last sort of step of counterinsurgency to stand up the Afghan army as we stand down, so to speak. And Lloyd Austin, General Austin, he was in charge of that in Iraq, the train and equip mission in Iraq as we withdrew from the country. And as we saw, that mission wasn't exactly successful, as the Iraqi army still has glaring holes in it, is, according to intelligence reports, unable to fend for itself. And same in Afghanistan. And from 2013 and 2016, he was in charge of, as head of Central Command, he was in charge of training and equipping moderate Syrian rebels, which obviously didn't pan out either. And during that hearing that Winslow referenced, I think earlier McCain, or maybe another member of the Senate, said, you know, we spent $500 million and the result is 4 or 5 trained soldiers about. So I think that's what sort of the expertise that Biden hoped he would bring to the Pentagon, because if you look at Biden's transition team, it's run by Kathleen Hicks of the CSIS, which is the think tank that takes a ton of military industrial complex money. And they have a gray zone project, which is about exploring how other countries train proxies and find kind of less than war, but more than diplomacy ways to interfere and meddle in countries' affairs. But when we do that same thing, gray zone activities, as they call it, it's called security cooperation, or train and equip, or security assistance. And so this transition team really lays it on heavy that this is going to be the model going forward, where DoD is going to continue to train and equip militaries across the world, in Africa and Latin America and the Middle East, pretty much anywhere considered Southern globally or developing. And as a result, I think we're going to see a lot more intervention. So it's on us to sort of say, okay, are we really training and equipping and doing this for like a legitimate reason, or are we doing it just to intervene in another country? And the risks of that are that intervention is often the problem. Intervention itself is often the problem. So with the Flournoy article that I'm not going to mention, but am going to mention now, as US troops surged in Afghanistan, same with casualties, and same with IED attacks, which were a function of the insurgency. So as the US went in to quell the insurgency spiked. So I think one of the main things we have to push is that intervention itself is the problem. And I think potentially, because of just the way military is structured in terms of education and doctrine, we could have a slight bonus in Austin who might not be as aggressive as Flournoy would, or any of Biden's transition team would be with respect to that. So I think we really have to pay attention to, one, getting this sort of model of train and equip evaluated, because it's never been evaluated. We don't know if it's working. The only anecdotal evidence we have is that it's not working. So I think we need to be cognizant that that's happening and really focus on removing ourselves from combat, removing ourselves from countries, and on the front end, reducing the defense budget, because we can mess around and try to reform legal authorizations as much as we want. But at the end of the day, we want to limit the power of US imperialism. And the best way to do that is through the defense budget.
Well, I think what we're so far saying is that somebody like General Austin is more the good soldier to carry out Biden's agenda. And so it's going back to pushing Biden and others in the national security areas, because he, unlike Flournoy, does not have so much of his own agenda to be promoting. And that is very important when we look towards the pivot to Asia. So Tabitha Chow, we're going to hear next. And you have been working on the issue of globalization quite a long time. And more recently, you have been the co-founder of Justice is Global project of People's Action. And I have seen you in many webinars in the last few months that where you talk about the problem of the new Cold War with China and how it translates into anti-Asian racism, and being part of the Chinese diaspora, what that means to you and the others in this diaspora. So I'm not sure where you want to take it now with the new news, but we're very happy to have you on. And please let us know what you think are the most important things for us to be following with the Biden administration vis-a-vis China.
Thanks, Medea, and thanks for having me here, and thanks for everyone for being here, and to all the speakers for rolling with the change in agenda. Is this news about General Austin came out just before we did this. So my approach is going to be because General Austin doesn't have the same sort of record as Flournoy does of having spoken and written at length around issues of analysis and strategy, and particularly with respect to China. Flournoy has written and said a lot about China, and as best as I can tell, General Austin doesn't have the same record. I'm going to approach this in terms of how can we understand the Biden camp as a whole and its approach to China, which has more moderate and more hawkish wings, even within Biden's the circle that of Biden's set of advisors, and I want to recognize that I'm very critical of the foreign policy and national security narratives that we see emerging from this part of the political spectrum. There's also some principles and values that I think are on the right track, and so I want to think in terms of what does a Biden administration and Defense Department, also State Department and all the rest, what do they have to do in order to uphold the best of the values that they've put out there? And what do we as progressives and leftists in the anti-war movement and other progressive movements, what kind of pressure do we need to apply on the administration so that it can live up to its highest ideals and not fall prey into some of the traps that I think are out there for an incoming Biden administration? So I'm going to drop a link in the chat. This is to an article I wrote in The Nation magazine back in July in response to the Democratic Party platform and what it had to say about China. So there's some differences between that and what we see coming out of the Biden team specifically, but by and large, it's the same. I would say my overall sense of where things are headed and what needs to shift hasn't changed significantly from my assessment of the Democratic Party platform back in July. So let me start with the good. These are things that I appreciate about shifts that we're seeing from the incoming Biden team in comparison to what we saw from Trump. These are also principles that were shared by Flournoy as well, even though she's definitely on the hawkish side by far when it comes to China. She too shared some of these principles that I think we as progressives should share. So first principle is that this talk of the new Cold War is dangerous. The idea that we're in a new Cold War with China is just a really bad and toxic framework that we need to reject. And that it is crucial that we need to avoid ending up in a hot war. We need to avoid any open military escalation with China. So these are the correct goals. There are some on the far right who don't share these goals. They love the Cold War framing. Some of them are agitating for escalation into a hot war. So we should be glad that we have allies in the Biden administration who see that this would be just absolutely disastrous. Going along with this is the idea that there's also, again, on the right, there's this talk about how we need to decouple our economy from China. Going along with that, very often are immigration restrictions targeting people from China, including what we saw from the Biden administration, where these blanket restrictions on Chinese international students. And as someone who has tried to organize with Chinese international students, this is like a direct threat to the progressive organizing that I try to do. So what we see from the Biden team is a rejection of this idea of decoupling, some of the correct criticisms of Trump's tariff war with China, how that only served to hurt the US economy and hasn't made conditions better for anyone in the US at all. And that we need to stop doing these like blanket restrictions on people coming from China, including Chinese international students. Another, I think, shared value is that there's been, certainly under Trump, increased pressure on a whole range of countries, particularly other countries in Asia and elsewhere in the global South, meaning, sort of Latin America and Africa, increasing pressure on a whole range of countries to choose sides. It's like, are you with us or are you with China? And there is a rejection from the Biden team, including even Michele Flournoy, that this is not a dilemma that we need to not impose this dilemma on these countries. It's not going to work, and it's not the right thing to do. So we need to not force countries to choose between siding with the US versus siding with China. They don't want to do that, and it's not the right way for us to proceed. So I think all of that is under the heading of the rejection of the Cold War framing and the rejection and the priority on avoiding ending up in a hot war. So I think that's all to the good. There's also a very correct priority placed on the need for cooperation between the US and China in order to confront shared global challenges, which are going to require US-China cooperation. COVID is one area where we need more US-China cooperation. Climate change, another place where we urgently need greater cooperation. And also issues of non-proliferation and denuclearization. This is, again, another place where the US and China need to cooperate. And I would add to that, I think this doesn't get remarked on in the same way in these contexts, but the need to create a more just global economy and to recover from what is probably a very severe global economic crisis that we're in right now. That is also another area in which we urgently need greater US-China cooperation. So those are two really good principles that we see coming out of the Biden administration. And again, even people on the more hawkish side like Flournoy also agree to those. So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is that from the Biden administration, we see a continued commitment to a set of goals around military and economic competition with China that are going to keep us on a trajectory of increasing conflict between the US and China, right? So even though the Biden administration is going to say, we need to manage this conflict very carefully. We need to avoid any kind of Cold War or hot war dynamics. We need to emphasize the need for cooperation between the US and China, even though there's issues that we need to deal with. So those are like the goals that they lay out for the US-China relationship. But despite that, the continued commitment to a set of military and economic goals around competition between the US and China are going to keep us on a path to continued conflict and escalating conflict. And in fact, keeps us on a long-term pathway towards open military conflict, even though that's the very thing that the Biden team says they want to avoid. There's a set of issues around the economy and a set of issues around the military that are really closely connected with each other. And we need to understand these two things as connected. We can't deal with foreign policy questions without also dealing with questions about the economic relationship between the US and China, which then brings into the conversation like the whole structure of the global economy. So let's see. So like really briefly on this point about the economy, we need to understand that the US, and this is going to be true of the Biden administration as well, has a commitment to maintaining economic supremacy over the entire world. So the US has this commitment to leading the global economy and maintaining economic power over every other country. There is also a commitment to maintaining US military hegemony, maintaining the power of the US military to control the entire planet. And these two goals are really closely connected. Like in short, one of the key functions of the US military is to keep the entire planet safe for the US-led global economic order, right? So these ideas of economic supremacy and military hegemony are really closely tied together, which means that when leaders in the US think about the threat of China, the idea that China is a threat to US economic leadership and that China is a threat to US military hegemony, those are like really closely connected. So they're connected as a matter of fact, they're connected in the eyes of the US ruling class. So we need to understand how they're connected as well. And that's going to affect our strategy. Let's see. So let me just talk a bit about the military side of this conflict. Maybe if there's time and people are interested, we can get into the economic side more as well in discussion. So the big picture problem that has been, an issue with the Trump administration, it was an issue previously with the Obama administration as well, and it's going to continue under Biden, is the continued U.S. commitment to military hegemony. So in particular, the power to control sort of like every square inch of the oceans is kind of what the goal there is. What this does is it commits the Biden administration to a strategy that is inevitably going to feed into China's entirely credible fear that it is at risk of being strangled by the US military in its own backyard. And that path is, over the long term, going to steadily increase the risk of open military conflict. We're at the risk right now of entering around like the actions of the US military and the actions of the Chinese military, a really dangerous feedback loop. And this feedback loop involves the US military, or Department of Defense and so on, perceiving that an action on behalf of the Chinese military is a threat, is an act of aggression. And in response, the US military attempts to defend against that act of aggression and engage in what, within the Department of Defense is going to be understood as deterrence. But that reaction from the US is going to get perceived by the side of the Chinese military as an act of aggression and a threat to Chinese military interests. And so they're going to react in turn against what they perceive as aggression against China. And then their reaction is going to get perceived by the US military as an act of aggression, and then they're going to react, and then so on and so forth. So we get this feedback loop where step by step, each side perceives the other side is acting aggressively, reacts to that, and then that reaction is perceived as another act of aggression by the other side, and that just keeps feeding into each other over and over again. So what we need to do here in the US is disrupt that cycle as much as we can within US foreign policy. And if I had any power within Chinese foreign policy circles, I would make that argument there as well, but I don't. If you do, like, please talk to whoever you know within the Chinese Foreign Ministry or whatever. I don't have those connections, right? So the power that I can hope to exercise is within U.S. foreign policy to try to disrupt that extremely dangerous feedback loop as much as possible. And when I thought we were going to be talking about Flournoy, I did a bunch of research into what she has written about this. And I think, even if she's not in the Department of Defense, she's still going to be present as a hawkish voice within the circles around the Biden administration. Like, I don't think her influence is going to go away. So we need to think about what that looks like the hawkish wing, the hawkish anti-China wing of the Biden administration. So her take was, in my opinion, extremely dangerous. So, she had the goal, like we all should, of avoiding any kind of open war with China, any kind of open military conflict with China. And her take on what the US had to do in order to achieve that goal of avoiding war with China was to quote, reestablish and sustain credible deterrence against an attack from China. And what that translates into is greater military spending in particular to invest in the part of the war machine that is going to threaten China. And increasing that threat of the US military against China is going to increase deterrence, which will prevent China from engaging in any kind of military aggression against the US or against Taiwan or Vietnam and so on.
Toby, can I interrupt you here?
Yeah.
Just to bring Winslow back into the conversation, because I think when you bring up the kind of deterrence that Michele Flournoy was pushing for, it's what Winslow writing about or has written about of the legacy weapons versus these new high-tech artificial intelligence, robotics, and Winslow, you talk about this very in great detail about the costs of that. And so I assume you think that this is going to be the direction that is going to be pushed by the military industrial complex with or without Michele Flournoy. But can you talk a little bit about that and the dangers of that?
Sure. What Michele Flournoy has been saying is nothing new. It's literally decades old. We've been down this road, not just before, we've been down this road constantly. And the result has been a disaster. Our budget is now as large as it's ever been since the end of World War II. The world threat is at an all-time low. Our forces are smaller than they were dramatically in each of the services. Number of brigade combat teams is way down. The number of combat squadrons in the Air Force and Navy is way down, and so on and so forth. These smaller forces, are not newer, they're older on average. Equipment inventories for aircraft are now about 25 years per aircraft. It's insane. We just saw a recent report come out about the status of competence in our pilots and maintainers in the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps is at a disastrous all-time low, not since World War II, since World War I. It's been a catastrophe. How the gimmick works is that you tell people you've got this brilliant idea, you're going to save money and make our forces better. You're going to develop technology that is transformational, revolutionary military affairs. Yeah, we've seen these terms before. And because this stuff is so wonderful, we can shrink our forces and have a better military. It's all easier to maintain. It's all cheaper in the long run. It's all wonderful. It's all garbage. The real world results of these kinds of agenda are what I described. Where this agenda comes from is corporate influence in, the infamous military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, academia, think tank conspiracy. And here we go again. Michele Flournoy was wearing that agenda as as jewelry. Now we're going to see the same thing. It's going to be a little bit more intelligently and less sort of techno worded kind of explanations, but it's going to be the same thing. And that's why I talked about those 4 positions I talked about earlier. Those 4 positions, the controller, the inspector general, director of operational tests and evaluation, and director of CAPE, are the offices that are the check and balance for this kind of foolishness. If you have the right kind of people running those offices. That is key. We've had good people in those offices, and we've had, carpets in those offices that people walk all over. That's something to keep an eye on, what the Biden team allows Secretary of Defense Austin to appoint or imposes on him. If it's a bunch of hacks, hold on to your pocketbooks. And all the problems we've got now are going to be way worse. One last comment about, I'm sorry, Tabitha, is that the correct pronunciation? Sorry. I agree with a lot of what you said, with this one caveat. These characters are politicians. As a staffer in the Senate for both Republican and Democratic senators, I was able to observe Joe Biden up close and personal as staffers can, at least as close as staffers can, for about 20 years. Joe Biden is a politician, and in the Senate, he was not much of a leader. He was an articulate follower. And I say that as something important and even hopeful right now, because the political winds are against all of this conflict we've been engaging in for the last 20, maybe even 30 years. Being the wet finger type, Joe Biden probably has a sense of that, and that this game may be up. He also has a problem of our domestic problems, which are, everybody's all too familiar with and are all too prominent in everybody's everyday life. He knows he's got to deal with that if he's going to be a successful president. The last thing he needs is a expanded conflict somewhere, let alone, just a big one. If he has any brains at all, he knows that, and he has. He's an improvement over Trump in that respect. So we'll have to wait and see. And so with that sort of cynical description, that's my ray of hope, that these politicians know that the game is up on these conflicts. The hegemony game, they're not going to stop playing that. But at least the conflicts we're now engaged in, let alone the imbecilical ideas of trying to generate a conflict with China over Taiwan or the South China Sea or any of that foolishness, I would expect will be out the window pretty quick. And so that's my ray of hope.
Well, that is hopeful. I want to move to you, Stephen, because our conversation has talked about a couple of things. One, we have so many crises to deal with, from the pandemic to climate issues, that the American people don't want to continue in these endless wars nor get involved in new ones. On the other hand, you have written about how people in Congress themselves are beholden to, or not beholden, but get money from these military contractors. And what we've seen under Trump is the times that he has tried, like very recently, to bring troops home from Afghanistan or Iraq. It's Republicans and even Democrats in Congress who say, whoa, stop that. We're going to pass a law saying you can't use any money to withdraw the troops. So how do we deal with the fact that there are so many of these conflicts of interest, whether it's now General Austin and being on the Raytheon board, or the individual Congress people and their ties to the military contractors?
Excellent question. For that, I would especially focus on Congress, especially the newest members, such as Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, who I right now have a lot of confidence in. I think those are the type of people, plus the squad. I think those are the type of people that we have to engage and say, hey, listen, we have to set a normative framework here and say publicly, I'm rejecting all defense contractor contributions because it's tantamount to corruption. I mean, you look at Lockheed's revenue last year, 70% of it came from DoD contracts, AKA public funds, AKA our money. So we're talking about a subsidized system here that I found more or less kind of explains Democratic votes on defense. The more a Democratic member of Congress receives, the higher the likelihood that he or she, usually he, unfortunately, will vote the way that industry wants them to vote. So I think we need to use these new members and say, hey, you can establish a social norm here, and you can be amazing on the domestic front and legendary on the foreign policy front by sort of establishing a norm that we're not going to take defense contractor contributions. And then the next step after that is to introduce a law via Campaign Finance Reform Act or something along those lines that bars those donations. And then along those lines, you can make all sorts of cool legislative provisions like, okay, if a company receives over half of its revenue from the government, it has to be beholden to federal government pay rules. So the median salary can be no less than 5 times, or the CEO salary can be no less than 5 times, or no more than 5 times the median employee salary. So we see at defense contractors, it's more like 300 to 1, because these CEOs of these defense contractors, again, our money, are making 20 plus million a year. So I think we have to engage with the best options that we have in Congress, who also happen to be political juggernauts. I mean, these are extremely popular politicians who really had no resources going into Congress on foreign policy, which is the reason why I started my think tank, and have done mostly well. And I think these are the type of people that we need to engage with to put defense spending on the map, because right now it's just sort of reflexive and automated. I think we need to politicize the hell out of it. And I think no better person than Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, or AOC.
Terrific. I'm going to turn to you two, and then I'm going to go to you all just for final comments. So you might want to think of what you want to close with. But Tabitha, we've had some questions, and I'm sure you get them constantly, about human rights abuses in China, treatment of Uyghurs, some groups. And, you know, what we see so much during this Trump administration and before is the selective criticism of human rights, the weaponization of human rights, but also real human rights problems that exist, whether it's in China or elsewhere. So how would you like to see this administration deal with human rights issues in China, and how would you like the public to deal with that?
Yeah, so this is one of the most difficult questions facing, I think, the anti-war movement as a whole, particularly as national security narratives increasingly become centered on China. So if you talk about the need to like resist aggression against China or anti-China politics, like one of the responses that you're sure is to get is like, well, doesn't this let the Chinese government off the hook for its human rights abuses within China, in particular against the Uyghurs, the crackdowns in Hong Kong, the threats against Taiwan, and the bullying in South China Sea, and so on. So my perspective on this is that like these are legitimate concerns that I share, but a really important point strategically, I believe, is that the further deterioration of the US-China relationship is going to decrease our ability to influence human rights standards within China in a positive way. It's going to make it more difficult for us to do anything to contribute to increased rights or welfare for people in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and so on. This is because the worse the US-China relationship gets, the more antagonistic it gets, the more it is going to seem, and this is going to be a very realistic impression on the part of people within China, in particular in the Chinese government, that that the US is going to be antagonistic towards China and aggressive towards China, and that is the trend, and it doesn't matter what China does around human rights concerns. I think it's going to be highly unlikely that you're going to find very many influential people in the Chinese government who take seriously the idea that if they improve the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, that is going to prevent the US military industrial complex from continuing its path towards increasing escalation with China. I think that's, I don't think anyone's going to think that, and I think it's an unrealistic thing to think. Similarly, in that vein, we've seen last year and then finally this year, increasing crackdown in Hong Kong, culminating in the national security law that the Chinese government imposed on Hong Kong. This has been like really devastating in my own work, in my the work that I put into trying to build some level of transnational solidarity between the US and China. So many of the potential links between just grassroots working class people in the US and our counterparts in China flowed through groups in Hong Kong, and they're now threatened by this national security law. And I organized with a number of people on the Hong Kong left. And this has been, the impact of the national security law has been absolutely devastating. But I think there is a convincing argument that has been made by Hong Kong leftists and some mainstream analysts like Ryan Hass, who is also within the Biden team orbit, a convincing argument that the collapse of the US-China relationship was something that escalated and accelerated the Chinese crackdown on Hong Kong. China saw that the relationship was headed towards just more and more collapse. China thought that increasing US aggression against China was just a given, and whether China treated people in Hong Kong well or poorly, that wasn't going to change that. So it didn't have a stake in responding to US pressure against China around Hong Kong. So China just totally ignored it because of how bad the relationship has gotten. So my perspective on this is that, a core commitment of mine is transnational solidarity with absolutely everybody. That includes people in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, in Taiwan. We need to not sacrifice those values and those interests. But from the perspective of those interests as well, like we need to avoid the worsening of this US-China conflict, right? So like in practice, how do we do that while also doing what we can to improve rights issues? I think that's a difficult question. I think one, just quickly around the stuff around Xinjiang, I think the labor rights angle is like a very progressive take on that issue. If you can link it towards issues of just international labor rights in general, right? So forced labor is a problem with Uyghurs in China. Forced labor is also a problem universally with the supply chains of transnational corporations. And the US has helped create rules in the global economy that systematically let transnational corporations off the hook for forced labor and other labor rights abuses all around the world. So if we can like deal with this problem that is specific to China in a way that can also lift up the way that this is a systemic issue in the global economy, that's a way to seek to build improvements. that isn't about escalating the US-China conflict. So a lot of questions about how to do that in detail, but that's my general take on it.
Thank you. That is wonderful. I go to the final wrap-up of everyone. I want to take off on what you said, Tobita, about how the pressure on China has made things worse for your colleagues. I think we would say the same thing in the case of Iran, where Code Pink has been working with groups there and find that when the Trump administration pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, it made things so much more difficult for civil society in Iran. And that's one of the many reasons that we're so anxious to see a Biden administration read that Iran nuclear deal, lift those sanctions and relieve the pressure on the Iranian people. And the other area that we were going to talk about tonight was it had to do with Flournoy and foreign policy, is the issue of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, because this is a very important campaign for Code Pink, is to stop the US support for the led war in Yemen. And I just want to let people know that there's going to be a wonderful International Day of Action on January 5th against the war in Yemen, with people all over the world coming out and saying that they want to see an end to that catastrophic war. For us, it is also wanting to end to the US supply weapons to Syria. And Biden says he wants to do this. We know that the strength of the weapon industry is very powerful, and it's definitely not a given. So we've got to be organized and use our time to really build up a stronger movement against continued war. So Winslow, why don't we go to you for your final comment?
Okay, thank you. I couldn't agree more that if Joe Biden has any brains at all, he'll establish some kind of equilibrium in our relationship with China. Let me take it back to General Austin. That was sort of the premise of our getting together as Secretary of Defense. We need to peel the onion with him. We need to understand what his advice was about Yemen, about arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the training mission, as Stephen pointed out. We need to understand whether he was a voice against some of this foolishness, as we see, as I intimate from his conflict with John McCain in that hearing. We need to find out about his relationship with Raytheon and Pine Island and the other one or two corporations. It's conceivable that it was an innocent relationship, or did he allow the corporations to exploit him to make a few phone calls to a few former colleagues and to spread his name around in some of their, self-advocacy inside the Pentagon? And was he a Flournoy kind of operator with the corporations, or was he just making some bad mistakes in signing on to the boards of these places? My guess is it's somewhere in the middle there. But we need to understand what the relationship is, and we need to not tolerate feeble excuses like, oh, these are all subject to non-disclosure agreements, so I couldn't possibly tell you a thing about all of this. That's a good reason to vote against them. And if we get a clear picture of him, we'll know whether it's a good or a bad idea to allow the waiver for him to serve as Secretary of Defense. If he turns out to be a lousy candidate, I'll be all in favor of not permitting the waiver. If he turns out to have some level of character and some level of willingness to stop the business as usual and Pentagon behavior, I'll be all in favor of waiving that, that prohibition. So let's see, let's peel the onion. Let's find out about him, and let's see how it goes. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for doing this. Appreciate it very much.
Yes, thank you for your great work over many years.
Thank
And
you.
Stephen,
Sure. I would like to thank you as well for hosting this. This is great. My last word is that try not to get cynical. I mean, because this is a tough nomination cycle. I haven't really been too pleased with any of the nominations so far. But the good thing about advocacy is that it gives you an outlet for that sort of rage you feel, which is good. And I think focusing on Congress, especially, probably not among this group, but many other people don't know how much Congress has, how much power Congress has. I mean, they have the power of the purse. So one of the main ways that the military-industrial complex functions is that they're able to lobby members of Congress on Capitol Hill, and they're also able to lobby them in their home district because they have factories and corporate headquarters everywhere. Advocacy can do the same thing too. We can, negotiate on the national level in DC and organize for those things. And also as sort of advocates, we can go at the local level too, to make it both national and local levels. So the advantage that we have over the military industrial complex is that we've got the people. They don't have a lot of people relatively. They have a hell of a lot of money, but they don't have the people. So thanks again.
excellent, excellent. Thank you. And Tabitha?
Yeah, I think just picking up on Winslow's comment about peeling the onion with General Austin, I think one important part of the onion to peel is where he stands around the military budget. So we know that Flournoy was going to be very hawkish on the military budget, and in particular that she was going to use these arguments around China to justify military spending. We have some indications that Biden is maybe thinking similarly, but is there some hope that General Austin will be maybe more open to negotiation and pressure around that crucial question? So I think that's something that we're going to have to figure out. And yeah, I also want to say, like, it is important not to get cynical. Like, we spent a lot of this time critiquing where we think General Austin might be, where we think the Biden administration is going to go. But like I said at the beginning of my piece, the Biden administration has set forth a set of goals and values that we should share, that there is a need for cooperation between US and China, that we should avoid any risk of military conflict with China, that we need to avoid allowing US-China tensions to translate into racist policies, really personally important to me. That's going to increase the amount of space for us to organize and build our power. And we should look for points of leverage there where we can appeal to some of the better values within the Biden team to push them further away from a militaristic agenda. So that's going to be hard, but it's going to be really important to identify the space that exists and understand that, like, these are opportunities for us and opportunities that did not exist under the Trump administration. And so we should look forward to doing what we can and exploring those opportunities in the years ahead.
Thank you. I think that's great advice and leaving us on a more positive note. And I think, Winslow, when you said to learn more about the ties with the companies, we will have a chance with Anthony Blinken when he goes for confirmation hearings to learn more about exec advisors and who their clients are, and say that it's BS to have these non-disclosure agreements, that the public has the right to know who your clients are. We also had a question, a comment from somebody around the issue of Saudi Arabia. It's not just stopping US from selling weapons, but they say we also should be pressuring the Saudis to stop the war. And of course, that really is the issue, to stop the war, and that the US should be putting up money for rebuilding of Yemen. And I want to say that Code Pink also has two campaigns that are important related to what you all just talked about, which is divesting from war, that you can do in your communities and your schools and your pension funds. And you can go to the Code Pink website to find out more about that, as well as a coalition that we're part of People Over Pentagon, really take some pieces of this Pentagon budget, examine it closely, and see where we can get some agreement on starting to cut away at this oversized Pentagon budget and free up some for any needs that we had. So I want to echo the positive nature of what you have said tonight, which is we are under a new administration come January 20th, that the possibilities are open to us, depend on our ability to organize, to mobilize, to inspire people, and to put forward a positive vision. So thank you all for joining tonight. Look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead. Peace.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thanks, Code Pink and everyone.